The countries that formed the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, like many countries in minority report, were part of an empire, the Russian Empire to be exact, and as the Russian Empire fought and fell, so did too the Baltics fight for their homes and independence, but would soon fall. But let's see how they rose first. The Baltic states were of vast importance to the Russians for trade and economics, but also for war aims, as Riga, the capital of Latvia, was an industrial center. Although Catherine and Alexander II wanted to have a policy of Russification like most colonial empires, so the Russian natives would settle the region and bring Russian culture and Russian language there, like Finland, Azerbaijan, and all those other countries under the Russian Empire. Estonia and Latvia had more autonomy than Lithuania, but the government was for the elites and the Tsarist handpicked people, and even some Baltic Germans had a say in parliament to please the German-Russia alliance at the time. They were actually in the lands way before Germany and Russia were actually countries in the 12th century, and they treated the people of the Baltics like serfs and even encouraged more Germans to settle the region. But Lithuania had ties with the Poles being the dominant of the two, and the Lithuanians didn't really want any more majority of Poles, but the Poles couldn't really think of a Poland without Lithuania. During the 1905 revolution, it was felt all over the empire, and it gave nations, mostly European ones, but some Central Asian ones, a chance to break away from the Russian Empire, and the Baltics seized the chance. When the Tsar planned to finalize the Duma, the Baltic states were there to show self-governance and self-ethnic determination. The Russians did strike back with the socialists and the revolutionaries to put the country under martial law, and the Russian army did arrest and kill those who were in the revolutionary crowds and protests. The Baltic Germans used the new martial law laws and the Russian murdering of civilians to settle old scores. Several people went into hiding, including leaders of tomorrow such as Kalis Ulmanis, the PM of Latvia, and Konstantin Pats, PM of Estonia. When war broke out, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia and the Baltic Duma expressed support and men for the Russian Empire. The Baltic Germans did help as well, as the blood for freedom was mostly seen as an ideology for natives such as Maoris and Indians and native Africans, but there was still news in European theaters of war for the Europeans. But in Europe itself, there was also the war euphoria as well, so everyone went to war with Russia. So, along with the men of the Baltics, they were conscripted into the Russian army in 1914. 60,000 Latvians, 1,200 Lithuanians, and the most being Estonia with 300,000, giving the Russians basically 500,000 men. The Russians had great success, but the defeats of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes left the Russians in the Great Retreat, which by 1916 the Germans had taken half of Latvia and all of Lithuania, and they had put Lithuania and half of Latvia under military administration, Ubas Ost. The state would support the war effort with requisition of crops and cattle, forced labor, and war economics, and they did announce annexation if they were to be conquered and win the war, which would come in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but not yet. But the Germans, like in Belgium, did start the political maneuvering and moves to turn the Baltics into support of the German Empire, with the Flemish nationalism over there, while the unoccupied country of Estonia and a larger chunk of Latvia didn't fare well either, as the scorched earth policy continued in force, removing the war equipment and making of 700,000 refugees, with burning villages and livestock. The Latvians did get it kind of pleasant, as they fled to Petrograd before 1917, so the refugees were there for schools and homes to set up to give them a sense of unity, and also establish organizations outside of the Russian ones created for them already. A band of mystic heroes was soon to be known, the Latvian Riflemen. The Russians didn't want much nationalism, but in August 1915, with everything going terribly wrong for the Russian army, after the Latvian militia proved themselves, so the Russians gave in after the Latvians told the Russians it would make more sense for them to fight for their homes than for some Archduke. Sorry, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but it is what it is. So 8,000 volunteers were trained into two Latvian rifle battalions, which were assigned to the Russian 12th Army. They had high morale, and the language barriers were very non-existent, and they also had a 100% literacy rate, so that was very impressive even for the Russian army at that time. They were the heroes who defended the lands, and the press made themselves the figures of nationalism. They were not in the Russian army, but they still took orders from the Russian NCOs. Nonetheless, it was still a great morale boost for the Latvians, and by 1916 there were 400,000 in 8 battalions. They were mostly in Riga fighting the Christmas battles. They held the line in -40 degrees Fahrenheit, but they lost them in January to the Germans, at a cost of 9,000 men dead. This, however, was blamed on the Tsarist officers as the Latvians thought them to be very incompetent. And as 1917 drew even closer, the red flags were waving, and that jump-started the soldiers' mutinies and the opposition to the Tsarist regime. They were the only Baltic state to do so. Estonia was divided on the matter and was already part of the Tsarist army, however, and the Estonians were already non-occupied and well defended as well, and Lithuania was occupied. Well, let's see what's going on in Lithuania. In Lithuania, things were getting kind of political as the radicals fostered by the Germans created a tabar, which was for self-government. The Germans also tolerated this, and of course they helped funded it after all, and the seeds of Lithuanian independence were now sown. So Lithuania was actually the first Baltic state to actually gain independence, well, self-government at least, and Estonia and Latvians would have to wait until the February Revolution. The Estonian Mapavi was created with the mayor of Tallinn at its head. The Bolsheviks tried to postpone both elections, but the Latvians held their own elections for a provincial council, and it was created in March. But it was immediately challenged by the socialist groups in the area. The socialists did win as they created the executive committee of the Soviet workers, soldiers and the landless in August. The infighting though didn't draw the questions of becoming independent countries or part of the new Russian provisional government country or even the Soviet state. With hunger landless people on strikes, the Bolsheviks, who never really had power in the region, gained support mostly from sailors and homeless people and everyone else to the Soviet cause. When they staged a successful coup in October, they had the support of the Baltic states, with the Latvian rifles at the forefront. They set up the Bolshevik government, and soon the Latvians had to flee because of the Germans coming from the south. The one last great battle of the Russian Empire, the Battle of Riga, was the last patriotic Russian battle for the Russian sailors, and then the Germans took over all of Latvia. The government who fled Latvia would create and help to create the Red Army, the Cheka, which is the secret police, and the government in Soviet Russia. The Estonians, unlike the Latvians, were mostly city folk, and they maintained in 1917 they were less of a provincial assembly and more of a governing body, and it represented all of Estonia. The Bolsheviks refused to discuss the independence, which hurt their position, and of course the Matavi had to leave to the advancing Germans. The peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, and the plans they had in early 1915 for the Baltics were scrapped. But they did still wanted the Baltic states to be very closely tied to Germany and to be governed by the Baltic German elites. The Lushwana, comprised of 35 Germans, 13 Estonians and 10 Latvians, wrote to the Kaiser to put the Baltic states under his protection. The war was still raging on, however, as Uber-Ost was still put into effect. German forces in the Baltics were to suppress nationalism and socialism, but that was still a very unrealistic goal, even post-war, as anti-imperialist national movements sprung up all across Europe and the colonies, and the great powers, and even Germany itself, could only hold on to them for such little time and such little control left. Even the Baltic Germans couldn't help but want independence. They started to carry out independence movements once they saw their aims could not be met, and they started to make the Baltics self-governing and more autonomous, but still allied with Germany, and even make it kind of a protectorate status for now. The German aristocrat Wilhelm von Uran was made King Mandugas II, as the Lithuanians kind of wanted to return to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and considered a constitutional monarchy. King Mandugas made a very big divide, as the Catholic Church and the Socialist Right had their own says, but mostly anti-German sentiment and maybe some behind-the-scenes stuff. But maybe another reason was the fact that Uranch never even set foot on Lithuanian soil in the first place. The Karabakh couldn't make a police force or a postal or military or basic national institutions. The real plan was to completely annexate Lithuania. Only in the last days of the war, as the war came to a close, the Germans, Max von Baden, Chancellor of Germany, promised the Lithuanians that they could have and take full control of their country. The monarch was suspended and the constitution was not a monarch constitution anymore, and that was made that day. The Baltics were very democratic until the Soviets arrived, and even all the way up to the Soviet collapse of 1991. The Lithuanians, Estonians and Latvians, even though they're all from different countries, held hands and formed a wall of solidarity from 1917 all the way up to 1991. they held their ground, and they were kind of the springboard for Bolshevism in the first place. So they still held their ground and still stood strong. They held their ground and they still stood strong for pretty much all the 20th century, honestly. They held their ground, they stood strong, even though they're from different countries. They had solidarity because they were the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania.